So I thought for today we would do the opposite of last week. And if you weren't here last week, that's fine. So last week we looked at Psalm 8 in a very meditative, contemplative, how would you look at it according to the practice of Lectio Divina, which is the ancient art in the church of reading something spiritually, which is all wonderful. But lest that you get the idea there's no place to study it, let's study it today, right? Because what I wasn't saying last week is we don't need to study, we need to do this instead. What I was bemoaning for myself is no one taught me all the way through 2 degrees in theology about Lectio Divina, which I wish that had been included. Not that I didn't benefit from the method of exegesis, which is actually getting out of the text its meaning, that I was given. I think that was tremendously helpful, and I use it all the time. One of the points is, when people look at studying the text, often people think, well, I can't do that. I don't have the training. I don't have all the tools. I don't have the knowledge. And then they're kind of like, I better leave it up to the experts to tell me what the Bible's saying. Right? So what we did last week requires no expertise. It just requires an open heart and a willingness to listen and see if it isn't the fact that the Spirit will speak into your own thoughts, elucidating certain things on which you can focus and pray and contemplate. Right? No expertise required, and a very rich way of reading Scripture. But this morning I thought, well, let's study it. And so I want to go through how we can do that. So we're back in Psalm 8. But, like I said, let's study it this time. Now, in exegetical methods, there are a series of ways that you look at the text, and they're called criticisms. It doesn't mean you're trying to find something negative. It means you're trying to look at it in a critical manner, to really examine it. So don't think about criticism as something like, I'm going to criticize somebody and say what they're doing is awful. It's like to really examine it and try and look at the details of it. And so when it comes to exegesis, which is a word which means getting out of the text its meaning, there's a series of what we call criticism, and each one looks at the text in a different way. The first, and these are not necessarily have to be done in a particular order, but I'm going to go over what they are, and we're going to do it a little bit with Psalm 8. The first one generally is called textual criticism. And here's where what you do is you look at the text you have before you. Now, if you don't know ancient languages, which most people don't know, and I don't even know well Hebrew, I don't know hardly at all. My Hebrew professor was prophetic. He said, when you guys finish this class, all you're going to remember is the Hebrew word melech for king. That's about all you're going to remember. And he's just about right. Because I am lousy in Hebrew. I got through it to get the degree, right? But what someone would do, if not knowing biblical languages, what you would do in this step is often read 3 or 4 different English translations comparatively. And so what you would be noticing, if we were doing this, we don't have time to do this morning in Psalm 8, we would read through it perhaps in the Revised Standard Version, and maybe the New American Standard Version, and maybe the New International Version, 3 or 4. And what you're looking for is differences in where you notice, they translated that a little different. And what that would tell you is there's probably some matter taking place right there. An ambiguity about wording or something. The translator are struggling at how to render it. So you look for that kind of stuff. You would look for, a lot of times you might have a Bible that has footnotes and gives you alternative words for, it's got a little A and you go down the bottom and it says, or could be translated this way. Or some manuscripts have this. That is all the business of textual criticism. And the idea is to try and get a real grip on, look, where are the anomalies, where are the problems, where are the issues regarding this text. Okay? That would be often the first step. A second step that we can do together is one that is historical criticism. So I'm going to read through it, and now we're looking for any hints of anything that can help us think about history. Is there anything in here that pertains to history? Okay, so let's read through the psalm together. The superscription at the beginning, which is not actually a formal part of the psalm, says, for the choir director on the Gittith, a psalm of David. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth, who have displayed your splendor above the heavens. From the mouth of infants and nursing babes you have established strength, because of your adversaries, to make the enemy and revengeful cease. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. All right. Looking through it for anything historical. See anything historical?
Well, the first thing that struck my mind is that they had a director of music in the temple.
With a choir director.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know anything about that history, but
yeah. Yeah, and so now the superscription to the Psalms, not all Psalms have one. They're not thought to be original, but they're also thought to be very old. So it's somewhat a tradition. Now, that doesn't mean it's inaccurate, but also you wouldn't want to live and die on the superscription.
Is Gittith what is the Gittith? Person?
I don't know. Is it an instrument, perhaps?
It's not super clear. We just know that it's some sort of musical term.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, and a lot of it's uncertain, like the word Selah that appears in some psalms. It is not to be read. It is a musical notation. I jokingly said this is guitar solo time, right?
Yeah. Or it could be in poetry they have pentameters that
it could.
Maybe it's the tune. It has to do with the tune they sing it to.
Yeah, and some of them are more obvious that they seem to be indicating the arrangement or something. But it's historical. The historical thing is that it says the Psalm of David. Mm-hmm. Well, the dates of David's life, roughly his reign ends in 960 or 961 BC. He starts his reign around the year 1000. So that gives us a time period. So if it in fact is a Psalm of David, what else do you notice in here that's of a historical nature? There's one other thing that I can see that's really kind of a historical nature.
Things that God has done.
Yeah, he's praising the works of God, but when we're talking history, we mean that kind of helps us place maybe where it is in the chronology of history, right?
Creation?
No?
The adversaries?
Yes. I'm thinking the enemies and adversaries. Now you might be thinking, so if this is David's psalm, when did he experience enemies and adversaries during his life, right? In other words, it could be written when he's on the lam running from Saul. And the enemies and the adversaries has to do with Saul and Saul trying to hunt him down, and he's hiding in the cave of Adullam, right? That's one period. Or maybe he's king, and now the adversaries are other nations. Does that make sense? See, in other words, it's a reference to a historical thing. There are adversaries and enemies that are on David's mind. But now we're just trying to say, historically, when could that be during his life? I guess you could even say, maybe as a shepherd, and the enemies and the adversaries are the lions and the bears that come for the sheep. I don't know. That's a little bit more of a stretch, right? But this psalm doesn't have a lot in it that you can say, oh, here's a reference that helps me think about where it occurs historically. As far as I know, we could just take the enemies and adversaries, and we could identify times in David's life where he was facing enemies and adversaries. Even though he relates this to God, right? I think it's still coming out of because God's doing this because of the enemies and adversaries, and he's experiencing that. But again, you could even question, is we're just talking about the adversaries of God, and it's got nothing to do with anything he's facing. All right? That would be the kind of thing you would do with historical criticism. Now, other passages or other stories, there's a lot more to go on. There's names, there's, maybe references to places, and you start delving into what does all that tell me about this text.
So, Greg, I had a question from
Sure.
last week also.
Yep.
Your translation reads, you made them a little lower than God, but all the translations I see says lower than the angels.
The angels, yeah.
That's textual criticism.
That's sexual.
Right.
Exactly. When you're doing the comparative thing, you go, wait a minute. Angels and God, this is really radically different. And you would start investigating what's going on.
Okay. Sorry, I got ahead.
Yes. Right? No, but you're exactly. That's textual criticism. And the goal of textual criticism is to try and to find out what we would call the original text. These texts were hand copied. And when they're hand copied, sometimes little errors creep in. And so these differences exist, and you have to start thinking, well, which of these two readings is most likely the original? And there's ways in which, in the discipline of textual criticism, that's worked out, or at least attempted to work out. So yeah, that would be a matter of that. All right, well, let's move on to, we've talked about what textual criticism is, though we've not done it. Too much detail there. We've talked about what historical criticism would be, but of course there's not a whole lot to go on. The next, at least the way I will do it, is literary criticism. Now what you do is you look at the literary features of this piece. And that has a lot to do with, is there a literary structure to it? What is the genre of literature that we're reading? Are there figures of speech? Is there an allusion? Is there an analogy? Is there, all these different literary aspects? So when you've looked at it in a historical way, now you turn your lens to say, now let me examine it as a piece of literature for what are its literary aspects. Now here we got more to work with because we got Psalm 8, right? Mm-hmm. So now it is a piece of literature. So what are some things we would say about it in a literary sense?
It repeats the first verse at the end.
Ding. Okay. So there's a thing of structure, right? It's opening and it's closing and it's exactly parallel, right? So that's part of the literary structure. There's some intentionality there.
But it's praise oriented. Not all Psalms are praise oriented.
Right. So this is and this is poetry, right? So first of all, it's poetry. We're not reading narrative. We're not reading, a didactic piece as teaching. I mean, it might be teaching, but it is a piece of poetry. And when it comes particularly to the Psalms, there are Psalms of lament. There's Psalms of individual lament as well as national lament. Sometimes it's, oh, I'm suffering, or sometimes it's, we are suffering as a nation. And so one of the things we do with the Psalms is we identify that. This is a psalm of praise. does it seem more individual, or does it perhaps seem more collective? Yeah.
He says, when I consider your heavens, that's first person. So you would expect him to say, who am I that you are mindful of me? He starts first person and switches.
Yeah. See, that's very interesting. It's like, here's my observation, but the conclusion is, the thought is that it's not just about me, it's about us, humanity. So it's a broader sort of thing, as the psalmist says, I'm thinking about what I'm observing, but then what is that saying about us as humanity? What is mankind that you, yeah. So see, now we're getting into those literary bits of these, yes.
There's a couple of anthropomorphic allusions where it says God, the work of your fingers, or the works of your hands.
Right. That's something, yeah, it's always good to remember that's not literal. God has no digits and God has no extremities. God is a spirit, right? So it's an anthropomorphism. It's attributing to God.
Easy for him.
Yeah, or not so much. Keep my lips moving correctly. So it's attributing to God human-like characteristics, like when we say the face of God. Well, he doesn't have two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. You know, it is not a face of God in that sense. So we often do that. We speak of God in human terms, which makes God relatable. But yes, so we've got some anthropomorphisms in the text.
The New International has some ambiguity about whether we're talking about mankind, them, or mankind, him. That the pronouns swap around a little bit. And I have a footnote that says, when it says them, it could mean him.
The wonderful, the two dominant languages of the Bible, Hebrew and Greek. There's also sections in Aramaic, which is ancient Syrian, but they're not as numerous by far. So we usually talk about two. They could not be more different. Could not. Greek is so precise. There are 24 versions of the word the, always to agree in number and masculine, feminine, or neuter, and singular or plural, and part of speech. There are 24 versions of the word the, always to agree. Hebrew's kind of like, we're just talking generally here, folks. You know, everything is kind of like, oh, it could be interpreted three different ways, and it's not very precise. So part of, you're going to run into, like what you're pointing out, Ron, is like, it's vague. And with Hebrew poetry, almost every line in Hebrew is made up of 3 words. Look how many we have in English trying to render those 3 words. Now, sure, those words have prefixes and infixes and suffixes and things, but it's frustratingly sparse, right? You almost kind of have, it's an art to translate Hebrew, and I'm not any good at it. But yeah, so you could say, how could that be vague as whether it's him or them? Welcome to Hebrew, right? It's just not always as clear. Okay, so the main feature of, and this, I'll just make this point about literary, is the main feature of Hebrew poetry is not rhyme or meter, it's parallelism. That's what made Hebrew poetry poetry. And parallelism means it sets 2 lines in parallel as a couplet. And those 2 lines are either synonymous or they're antithetical. And then the structure can get bigger. You can have a structure where the first and fourth line are parallel and the 2 in the middle, the second and third, are parallel. And this is what made Hebrew poetry poetry. English poetry usually is rhyme and meter. Right? That's what we identify as, oh, that's poetry because it ends in me and then it says we, right? Or, you know. So, but that's not, there's no rhyming in Hebrew poetry. It's all about the parallelism. So notice, so like in verse 2, you've got the first statement, from the mouths of infants and nursing babes you have established strength, and then you have 2 parallel statements. Because of your adversaries, to make the enemy and the vengeful cease. So there's there's a parallel between because of your adversaries and the enemies. So, and that's what Hebrew poetry does. It speaks like that. So sometimes if you're having trouble knowing what one line means, it's maybe synonymous with or the opposite of the following line. And that can help you go, oh, I see what it means here because that's the nature of it. And so that's throughout the whole thing here. So like in verse 6, you've got parallel synonymous statements. You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. Those are synonymous. But 5 is contrasting. You have made him a little lower than God, and yet you crown him with glory and majesty. So there's a kind of a little bit of a tension. Like you made him lower, and yet you made him great. And that's, so you could go through in a literary sense saying, okay, this is poetry, and examine it in that way. That would just be a feature of reading poetry in the Old Testament. All right. Well, let's move on to another criticism. So we're just looking at ways to look at Psalm 8 if we were studying it rigorously. Not what we did last week was reading it spiritually. And again, I'm saying this is good too, right? This is not like to be cast aside. So another criticism is called form criticism. And what is meant by form criticism? It comes from the idea that each piece has a particular form. And that form is because of how it was used in its context. The German scholars don't develop a lot of this, and so their phrase is sitzen leben, which means a setting in life. And what they would say is, and they were right about this, is when we're looking at these ancient texts, these texts, they weren't just put in a book that someone put on a shelf. These functioned in the community. Like it has a form that was used in a setting in life. And they asked the question, so in what setting was this used? And what does that tell us about the form in which it was made? Now, we've already made the observation that it is praise and not lament, or something like that. So, and we've noticed something about the pronouns. Some of them are singular and some are plural. Now, some of this becomes imaginative, So when would you imagine this psalm perhaps being produced, and for what purpose, and used?
At the Seder, maybe?
Okay, yeah, so you could raise the question. Is it used in temple worship? Is it used kind of maybe in a different kind of gathering? Is it a personal devotional piece? It has some aspects of looking like a personal devotional piece, right? That the psalmist, that David wrote for himself, his own reflections and his own praise to God. But then even if you say, well, it was kind of a personal piece, it was included in the songbook for the nation. So now when was it used? Would it have been used like at the Day of Atonement? Is it used at a time like that? Would it be used at Passover perhaps? You start asking, would it be used at Pentecost? And you'd have to know something about these different religious festivals and holidays and start trying to pose, when might they use it? Well, probably not a time of national mourning, right? Because it's not the lament. It's not articulating the people's grievances. So what might have been the kinds of settings in which people would have said, let's stand up and read Psalm 8, even responsibly, that they might have done it that way, an antiphonal thing. Is that making sense? Now, we're only looking at a psalm. Sometimes this becomes even more pertinent with other types of literature. The Psalms are easy because they're pretty much used in worship. But some other types of literature, you're like, well, when exactly was this used? I mean, they didn't put it on a shelf and leave it there. Like, on what occasion would they pull this out and have someone read it? So that's part of this, right? Are you aware that the book of Psalms is divided into 5 books? Go to Psalm 1. And notice what your Bible should say. Mine does not. Bad or bad app. If you go to Psalm 1, doesn't it say book 1?
Yeah.
There's 5 books.
Yeah.
Do you know why there might be 5 books? God spoke to the people through Moses in 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are God's word to his people. The Psalms are in 5 books, which are the words of the people back to God. There's a kind of synergy going here. Right? So if you look at, if you were to go to Psalm 42, it says, Book 2. And so on, Psalm 73, Book 3, Psalm 89, Book 4. So you start going, no, not 89. So it's 42 through 72, 73 through 89, 90 through 106, 107 through 150. It's divided into 5 books. Now here's what's interesting is those collections, those sub-collections have certain characteristics. And you've got in this first collection, Psalms 1 through 41, more of David's Psalms than you have in the other sections. So more frequently is it David's Psalms. So you start looking at some things like that and you go, okay, this is something about how maybe it was used, how it was collected, and how it was used. Right? And we don't know who ordered the collection. So sometimes you'll find, well, in one of these sections there's more laments than there are praises. This first section is more praise, and it's more David. Not that every psalm is identified as a psalm of David. And some of them that weren't identified as psalms of David could be psalms of David. There's other ones identified as like the psalms of the sons of Korah and things like that. But not all, of course, have an identification. But they are grouped somewhat thematically. And so that kind of, again, we're trying to understand, this is how we would study Psalm 8 and get a lot out of it. But see how different it is from last week? It's not reading it as in a spiritual manner to contemplate and meditate on the text. This is to study it, to understand what am I reading, what am I looking at, how was it used, who wrote it, what was going on in their lives. All right? And then later it gets divided into these 5 books and arranged, and they're put together somewhat thematically, not strictly, but you start seeing this is what they were doing, right? This is how they were gathering these up.
So what are the themes of the 5 books?
That I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, I don't know. You could put that query in and say, and I'm sure you can find someone who gives kind of some of the thematic thing. I just didn't make notes about each of the 5 books. And I mean, I know sections, like there's the Songs of Ascent, which are psalms that have to do with going to Jerusalem for a festival. And it either starts or ends in 121. I don't remember.
The only thing I can think of is lots of hand cramps
Yeah.
on the writing.
Yeah. So you said it starts in one. Yeah. So, and there's a bunch in a row, and they're all called the Psalms of Ascent. And now that's easy to know sits and leaving. When was it used? When you're on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and your little caravan's all singing these songs as you approach the city. And you say, look into the hills. You know, it says, look into the hills. Well, what are you doing? You're getting close, and you can see the holy city, right? So those are grouped together. The Psalms of Korah, which occur in the 40s, are all grouped together, right? So there's groupings within these books. But offhand, I didn't make notes.
Would they only hear this at temple, or were the people that memorized the Psalms that went around reciting them? Like with British literature, there were people like your job was to recite Beowulf. That was your job. Go around reciting Beowulf so people could hear that story. So were there people who did that? Do we know?
That's a good question. I like the parallel. No, it wasn't just in temple, right? Especially after Babylon, when they established the synagogues. I mean, my point earlier was that sacrifice never happened in the synagogue. There was no altar and no priest, and they didn't offer. And synagogues developed because they were in exile and there was no temple. The temple was in ruins back in Jerusalem.
Right.
So they set up this thing about where we'll just meet in these little groups. As long as you had 10 people to make up a synagogue, you had a synagogue. And so synagogue became a form of worship when you were removed from the temple. Now, prior to that, yeah, it's not like there wouldn't have been people singing together and doing things, but a lot of the worship would have been focused on ritual that happened at the temple. After Babylon, certainly by the time of Jesus, a lot of the worship is happening in each village in the synagogue on the Sabbath.
Were there people that memorized this stuff?
Yeah, and that's a great question. You sparked my curiosity, because you wonder whether the culture had something like that. Because the scribes were experts in the law, and because that's what their job was to copy this. Well, of course they learned it. Did they, like you're suggesting sometimes, was one of their functions to recite that? We know that people would pull out a scroll and read it. And of course, not everyone, certainly everyone did not have a scroll. There's none of that. But not even everyone would be able to read it. So they're doing it publicly. They're reciting it for others. That's a great
Not every synagogue had access to scrolls, and at some point in Jewish history, and I can't tell you when, there was a role that was required in each synagogue where one person who had memorized all of the text was required to be there.
Okay. Neat. So, see, this is where the study brings us, and that's right. This is rich, right? It's not the same as what we were getting last week, but this is rich, and that's why I would not want last week to mean, okay, we just need to do that and not this as well, right? We learn a lot from learning the history and all these aspects, but if all we ever do is study the text and we never meditate on it like we did last week, you get a lot of facts in your head and a lot of information, but you may not be relating spiritually to the God who's in the text speaking to you, right? That's why it's a both and, not an either or here. So there's another, there's another two criticisms that we can mention. One is called traditio historical, which means the historical tradition of this text. And it kind of traces the fact, with some texts, they were oral before they were ever written. So the history of the tradition of a certain story it was told around the fires in the home before anybody ever put pen to paper. Now, maybe not with the Psalm 8, because the Psalm 8 probably originated. Now, did David compose it, and did he write it down when he composed it, or did he write it down later after having composed it? Did he compose it and just memorize it? Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I don't know if he always wrote it out as soon as he did it. But with other things, even when you're reading the New Testament, a lot of stories perhaps about Jesus were told orally long before anybody ever gathered them and put them into a gospel. So if we were like looking at the Gospel of Matthew, like today's story from Matthew, you might say, well, that story about that woman getting healed was told for years and years before. Matthew didn't write it down for 30 years later. How many people may have told that, or even there may have been a written part of that story that it was written down but not incorporated in a gospel. Someone wrote down that event and then was later gathered. So one of the criticisms is to look at how a particular text probably passed through various stages. In the case of Psalm 8, let's say David wrote it down immediately. But it wasn't in a collection. It was not in the National Songbook. Right? It wasn't in book 1 of 5 books. So at first, who knows how long, it just existed as another song of David, another prayer of David. At some point later, it got gathered. And we're all 50 150 gathered at the same time, or were they gathered somewhat sequentially? Again, it's sometimes we have clues, sometimes we don't. But at least to be aware, things often existed orally, then they were written, then they got incorporated into a larger composition, and then maybe reached the final form that we have them. That's just how things went, right? Our Bible kind of came together slowly, right? It didn't like descend out of heaven. Here's 66 books. People were writing things, people were telling things, they existed bits here and there, they all got brought together. Over time, they got composed into books, it all got gathered up. It's a process. That's just how it happened. Okay, last criticism I'll mention, and then we're going to be done, is there is what is called rhetorical criticism. Rhetorical criticism looks at, of course, the rhetorical argument or reasoning of the text. And certainly we could do that in Psalm 8. There's a lot of reasoning. This, therefore this. The rhetorical argument that's being made. The other aspect of rhetorical criticism often incorporates if there's evidence of editors. And lots of times there's indication that there are editors. That someone later edited this. You find that a lot in Old Testament stories when it tells a story and then it says, and those rocks are still here to this day. Well, that's somebody later talking about how when they crossed the Jordan going into Canaan, they picked up those rocks and they built a little, monument to the fact they had crossed the Jordan. And then the text says, and those rocks are here to this day. Well, that's obviously far enough from the time it happened that it's significant to point out they're still there, right? Well, who added that? Probably not the person who wrote down the event initially, right? And you find little commentary, little edits, sometimes explaining something. Oh, and the Jews used to have this practice of doing this, right? Well, who wrote that? Somebody later writing out an explanation, an editor. And again, so you look, when you're looking at a text, is there evidence not only of its history of transmission through these different oral, then perhaps written, then perhaps collected, then perhaps, is there also some editing that seems to have happened to bring it to what we would call its final place? All right. That's probably enough criticisms for today. But my point is, do you see that this also is rich? But what I don't ever want someone to do is like, well, that's the only way to study the Bible, and I never got a theology degree, so I guess I can't do it. I guess I'll just come on Sunday and someone else will have to teach me what it means.
I feel more clever after. I feel like I'm clever after I've done this kind of criticism.
Yeah.
Intertextual criticism is the most fun because Psalm 8 is intertextually just playing with Genesis 1.
Yeah. The whole where does it fall in the canon and how does it relate to other texts within the canon? And then you would look up, is Psalm 8 quoted anywhere in the New Testament? Well, we were familiar with some of these. I mean, when you read Psalm 8, you're like, I've heard that before. You just didn't hear it from Psalm 8. So you start, it's playing with Genesis. It's, so you start looking at all that. And all of this, I'm just saying, it's wonderful. And if you have a desire to do it, really great. And it complements a meditative reading. But if, like, my Tanzanian brothers and sisters could read a text meditatively and have none of this information of understanding Jewish culture or history, nothing outside their own tribal bounds. They don't know anything about Judaism or what Palestine is like or what the world was like 3,000 years ago. But they don't need to. They can read the text. God can speak to them, and they can come out with these meditative spiritual readings that's not dependent on study. That's the distinction I want to make, right? Say both are valuable, both approaches are valuable, but you don't have to be a scholar of the Bible to read it.
Well, it's enriching.
Yeah.
It's very enriching. You know, you can do that, I can be working on this quilt, everybody's got their own thing they do.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It is enriching when you can, and that's why it's a helpful thing to look at a Bible commentary or something about something that gives you backgrounds to the culture of the time. That can be super enlightening. You can go, wow, I didn't realize that they would have been doing this. That helps me understand it. So it's very helpful, but not absolutely necessary. You can read it not having a clue even about who David is and the nature of his reign and all the politics involved in that, right?
The way I've heard African brothers, I'm going to have to meditate on Aviva's anthropomorphically and on David's intertextually.
Yeah, the intertextual
figure out those two words and how I can read this.
What were you going to say?
My favorite way that that's been explained is a symphony. You can go to a symphony and just listen and just think, this is so beautiful. Or if you have studied oboe for 40 years and you hear the oboe part in the symphony, it's so much more enriching to you, but it's beautiful for everyone. It's just you've got this unique experience on something.
Holistic. It's
Yeah. No, that's a great analogy. I like that. That's what I'm trying to get at, right? Yeah. I didn't want last week, because when I was thinking after last week, I thought, what do I do Sunday? I said, I need to make sure that it didn't come across like ignore all commentaries and all that, and just read this and try and listen to it spiritually. That was the missing piece for a lot of us. We did a lot of Bible study. No one really was helping us do so much of this Lectio Divina spiritually. So that's why I thought, well, this week, let's look back at the study stuff and let's affirm that's very valuable.
Yeah.
But you don't have to worry if you're not familiar with that as someone else is. You can still read it in this meditative way we did last week, right? And so we get very different perspectives of Psalm 8 from this week and last week. And hopefully this week we start saying, wow, there's a lot of intricate things. We could get into like the literary structure. We start looking at the lines as now you're saying, is it following a Genesis pattern? The oxen, the heavens declare or he's talking about heavens first. It's kind of following the order of the Genesis account. And you start going, oh, there's a structure here, right? Very intentional. But that you get one perspective, you get a very different perspective when you're asking, what strikes me in this text, and is the Holy Spirit saying something to me? Very different but complementary things. All right, well, we're going to stop there. Thank you for coming.